I found her diary 15 years after she vanished. All this time I had been hunting ghosts. Apaches took the blame for a crime they never committed. I am Josiah Kane. My betrothed Sarah disappeared on the trail to our wedding near Devil's Canyon in the spring of 1877. The territorial authorities told me there were no survivors. They showed me charred wagons and scattered belongings. They pointed to arrow marks and spoke of savages. I never believed their story. Now I hold the truth in my hands. The man who sold my Sarah lives as a respected merchant in Prescott. He walks free while she lies in an unmarked grave. Not for much longer. Her words will guide my vengeance. I will use her diary to destroy every man who harmed her. This is my promise to Sarah. I first met Sarah Lowell in the winter of 1875 in Missouri. I had come east from the Arizona Territory seeking investors for my silver claim. The mine showed promise. I needed capital to develop it properly. Sarah was the daughter of my banker. She brought tea during our meetings. She had golden hair that caught the lamplight and eyes the color of a summer sky. She spoke with intelligence about books and politics. I found myself lingering after business was concluded. Soon, I was calling at the Lowell home without financial pretext. Sarah had been raised with refinement and education. She played piano and spoke French. Her father had sent her to a ladies' academy in Boston. Yet she possessed a spirit of adventure uncommon in Eastern women. She asked endless questions about life in the territories. She traced the paths of rivers and mountain ranges on my maps with her slender fingers. The wildness of the frontier called to her. When I asked for her hand 6 months later, she accepted without hesitation. Her parents were less enthusiastic. Mr. Lowell agreed to our engagement on one condition. I must establish a proper home before sending for Sarah. The Arizona Territory was no place for a genteel young woman without suitable accommodations. I returned west with new determination. I threw myself into developing the mine and building our future. The strike proved richer than anticipated. Within a year, I had constructed a substantial house on the outskirts of Prescott. It had glass, windows shipped from San Francisco. The parlor boasted a piano waiting for Sarah's touch. We exchanged letters throughout our separation. I still remember the joy I felt seeing her delicate handwriting on an envelope. She wrote of her preparations and her dreams for our life together. She sent fabric samples for curtains and described the books she was bringing west. Her final letter announced she would travel with the spring wagon train of 1877. It would leave from Kansas City on April 10th. She enclosed a miniature portrait of herself, which I carried everywhere. The night before Sarah was to arrive, I could not sleep. I rode out at dawn to meet the wagon train at the territorial crossing 20 miles east of town. I waited all day. No wagons appeared. The next morning, a cavalry patrol found me still waiting. The lieutenant looked grave when I explained my purpose. There had been an incident 2 days prior. A small party had separated from the main wagon train. They were reported missing. The army had found evidence of an attack in Devil's Canyon. They presumed all travelers dead. The lieutenant advised me to return to town. I refused to accept this news. I rode immediately to Devil's Canyon with the patrol. The scene was one of apparent violence. 2 wagons stood abandoned. Supplies were scattered across the ground. There were signs of fire, and what the soldiers insisted were Apache markings. I searched frantically for Sarah or her belongings. I found nothing that confirmed her fate. No body, no blood, nothing of her possessions except a single hair ribbon caught on a creosote bush. The territorial officials declared all members of the party victims of an Apache raid. They listed Sarah among the dead. I could not bring myself to believe she was gone. The Apaches had been peaceful in that region for months. The evidence seemed too convenient, too arranged. I spoke with the wagon master of the main train. When it arrived, He remembered Sarah clearly. A young lady traveling alone had attracted notice. He confirmed she had joined a smaller party that chose to take the Devil's Canyon route despite warnings. The guide had promised it would save 3 days. Travel. The guide was a man named Fletcher who claimed to know the territory well. I reported my suspicions to the marshal. He dismissed my concerns as the delusions of a grieving man. The case was closed. The Apaches were blamed. No investigation would be pursued. I was advised to accept my loss and move on. I could not. I would not. I sold my mine and my house. I used the money to begin my search. For 15 years, I have wandered the Arizona Territory seeking any trace of Sarah or the guide named Fletcher. I took odd jobs when my funds ran low. I learned to track from a Yavapai scout. I studied the Apache language and customs. I discovered they had not been responsible for any attacks in that region during that spring. I became a ghost myself, always moving, always searching. The settlers and townsfolk came to know me as the mad seeker. Children whispered as I passed. Women crossed the street to avoid me. I grew lean and weathered. My once dark hair turned grey before its time. But I never abandoned my quest. I never stopped believing I would find the truth. The territory changed during my 15 years of searching. The railroad pushed through. New towns sprang up along its path. Cattle ranches expanded across the grasslands. The Apaches were forced onto reservations. Those who resisted like Geronimo were hunted relentlessly. I watched civilization creep across the wild places. I saw how the natives were portrayed as savages to justify taking their land. It became clear to me how convenient an Apache attack could be for those with something to hide. As I traveled, I began to hear whispers, stories of women who disappeared from wagon trains, only to resurface in mining camps or remote ranches. Tales of guides who led parties into ambush for a share of the plunder. I learned of a network of men who preyed upon travelers. They targeted those carrying valuables or traveling alone. Young women were especially vulnerable. The more I heard, the more convinced I became that Sarah had fallen victim to such predators. I spent 3 seasons tracking a man named Fletcher through the saloons and gambling halls of the territory. I discovered he had worked as a guide for several years after Sarah disappeared. Then he vanished. Some said he had struck it rich in a gold claim. Others claimed he had been killed in a card game. No one seemed to know his fate with certainty. The trail grew cold. I began to fear I would never learn the truth. Last winter, I found myself in the northern reaches of the territory. A severe snowstorm forced me to seek shelter in an abandoned mining camp near Devil's Canyon. The Apaches avoided this place. They believed evil spirits dwelled in the caves that honeycombed the canyon walls. I had no such fears. I made camp in the largest cave as the blizzard raged outside. While gathering wood for my fire, I noticed something strange. A section of the cave wall had collapsed recently. Beyond it lay a passage that had been sealed for many years. Curiosity drove me to explore. The passage extended deep into the mountain. It showed signs of human habitation. Old torches remained in wall brackets. Boot prints could still be seen in the dried mud of the floor. I followed the tunnel until it opened into a larger chamber. Here I found evidence of long occupation. Rotted blankets, rusted cooking utensils, empty whiskey bottles. In one corner stood the remains of a crude cage, built of timber and rope. Something terrible had happened in this place. As I examined the chamber, I spotted something half buried in the debris. An old saddle lay against the far wall. Its leather was cracked and stiff with age. The silver conchos that once decorated it had been pried off. I might have passed it by without further inspection had I not noticed a familiar pattern tooled into the seat. Sarah had described her traveling saddle. In a letter, she had specially commissioned it with roses, and her initials worked into the design. I rushed to uncover the piece. The roses remained visible, though faded. The letters SL could still be discerned. My hands trembled as I lifted the saddle. Something shifted inside it. The lining had been slit open and re-sewn roughly. I tore at the stitches with my knife. From within the padding I withdrew a small book bound in faded blue leather. I knew it instantly. Sarah had written of the diary she kept, a gift from her father upon our engagement. She had promised to record her journey west so that our children might someday read of their mother's adventure. I held her lost words in my hands at last. I read by firelight as the storm howled outside. Sarah's elegant script filled page after page. The early entries sparkled with excitement and hope. She described the spring landscapes. She wrote of her fellow travelers. She spoke of her eagerness to begin our life together. Then came the entry that changed everything. The wagon master had introduced her to a guide named Fletcher. He had suggested a smaller party might make better time through Devil's Canyon. Sarah and 4 other travelers had agreed to his proposal. They separated from the main wagon train on April 18th. The next entry revealed her growing unease. Fletcher is not what he first appeared. He watches me when he thinks I am not looking. Last night I overheard him speaking with Mr. Reeves about a detour. They mentioned meeting someone. When I questioned this morning, Fletcher claimed it was a shortcut known only to locals. Mrs. Palmer shares my concerns. The terrain grows more desolate. We seem to be moving away from the main trail. I wish now I had remained with the larger party. The entries that followed confirmed my worst fears. The small party had been deliberately led astray. On the 3rd day, they were joined by 3 rough-looking men, whom Fletcher introduced as hunters. That night, Sarah awoke to screams. The Palmer couple were killed immediately. Mr. Reeves and the other traveler, a young man named Wilson, were beaten and bound. Sarah managed to hide her diary in her saddle before she was discovered. The final entries were written in a shaky hand during moments when she was left alone. They have taken everything of value. Fletcher claims he will deliver me safely to Prescott if I cooperate. I do not believe him. I have heard the men discussing their plans. They mean to sell me to a man who owns a house in Weber Creek. God, help me. They killed the others this morning. Fletcher shot Mr. Reeves himself. They spoke of making it look like an Indian attack. The man they call Boss seems to be in charge. He has a distinctive scar across his cheek. His real name is Nathaniel Harper, though the others call him Scarface. I must hide this diary again. Someone is coming. Josiah, if by some miracle you find this, know that I loved you until my last breath. They are coming now. God be with me. That was the final entry, May 15th, 1877. I sat motionless as dawn broke outside the cave. 15 years of searching had led me to this moment. Sarah had been betrayed, murdered. Her disappearance disguised as an Apache attack. The men responsible had gone unpunished. They had continued their lives while hers had been cut short. Fletcher, Reeves, the man called Scarface. These names burned into my mind, but it was the last page of the diary that truly set my course. In a hurried scrawl, Sarah had listed names and details, the men who had taken her, their connections in the territory, the businesses they used to launder their blood money. Among them was a merchant in Prescott, N. Harper, owner of Harper's Emporium, established 1878, a respected businessman known for his philanthropy and civic leadership. The timing matched perfectly. 1 year after Sarah's disappearance, Harper had opened his store with mysterious capital. The diary revealed the source of his fortune, the blood and suffering of innocents like my Sarah. I closed the diary and made my decision. I would return to Prescott. I would confirm that this N. Harper was indeed the Scarface from Sarah's account. Then I would bring a reckoning upon him and all who had participated in her murder, not with the swift violence they had shown their victims, but with a calculated destruction that would strip away everything they had built upon their crimes. I would use Sarah's words to dismantle their lives piece by piece. Justice had been denied too long. I left the cave as soon as the storm abated, the diary secure inside my coat. I traveled south toward Prescott with new purpose. The grief that had been my constant companion for 15 years transformed into something harder, colder, more focused. I had mourned Sarah as lost. Now I mourned her as murdered. The difference hollowed me out and reforged me into a weapon. At night I read her diary again and again. I memorized every detail, every name, every location. I traced her final days. Through her increasingly desperate words, I imagined her fear. Her courage in recording what she knew might be her final testament. The thought of her alone among those predators nearly broke me. I wept for the first time in many years. Not the wild sobs of fresh grief, but the quiet tears of a man who finally understands the full measure of what was taken from him. I stopped at a trading post in the mountains to gather information. The owner remembered me from previous visits. He commented on the change in my appearance, my new determination. I explained I was returning to Prescott to settle permanently. I asked casual questions about the town. Who were the prominent citizens? How had things changed in recent years? The trader spoke at length of Nathaniel Harper. The merchant had expanded his business considerably. He now owned the largest emporium in the territory. He had married the daughter of a territorial judge. He served on the town council. He was respected, admired. His scarred face was attributed to a childhood accident, a story he told with practiced humility. The trader mentioned that Harper was known for his charitable works, particularly his support of the orphanage. He sponsored a yearly event to raise funds for children left parentless by Indian attacks. The irony struck me like a physical blow. The man who had orchestrated such attacks now posed as a benefactor to their victims. I struggled to maintain my composure as rage threatened to overwhelm me. I left the trading post with my suspicions confirmed. Nathaniel Harper and the Scarface of Sarah's diary were one and the same. I considered going directly to the authorities with the diary. I quickly dismissed this plan. Harper had powerful connections in Prescott. The territorial judge was his father-in-law. The marshal was likely his friend or in his debt. The diary alone might not be considered sufficient evidence after 15 years. I had seen how easily officials had accepted the Apache attack narrative before. Without bodies or witnesses, they would be reluctant to pursue a prominent citizen. No, official justice was not an option. I spent several days in the wilderness wrestling with the path before me. I was not a violent man by nature. I had never killed except in self-defense. Yet the thought of Harper living his comfortable life while Sarah lay in an unmarked grave filled me with murderous intent. I imagined confronting him, forcing a confession at gunpoint, ending his life as he had ended hers. The fantasy provided momentary satisfaction, but no real peace. I realized that death would be too quick, too merciful. Harper and his associates had not simply killed Sarah, they had stolen her future, our future together. They had built their prosperity on her suffering and the suffering of others like her. Justice demanded they experience the same slow destruction, the same loss of everything they valued. I would use Sarah's diary not as evidence in a court of law, but as a guide to dismantle their lives. I would become the instrument of a more perfect retribution. On the final night before reaching Prescott, I made my decision. I read Sarah's last words once more by firelight. I touched the faded ink where her tears had fallen on the page. I promised her that those responsible would pay the full measure of their debt, not through quick violence, but through a carefully orchestrated campaign that would expose their crimes and strip away their ill-gained respectability. I would be patient, methodical, invisible until the moment of revelation. I slept soundly that night for the first time in 15 years. I entered Prescott at dawn on a crisp autumn morning. The town had grown substantially in my absence. New buildings lined the streets, a proper courthouse stood in the square, ladies in fashionable dresses promenaded on boardwalks, gentlemen in fine suits conducted business. Civilization had firmly established itself in what had once been frontier. I felt like a revenant, a ghost returning to a world that had continued without him. My first task was to establish an identity. I could not operate as Josiah Kane, the mad seeker. That man was too recognizable, too easily dismissed. I needed to become someone with access to Harper and his circle, someone they would welcome rather than avoid. I had funds remaining from the sale of my mine, not a fortune but enough to present myself as a man of modest means. I purchased new clothing, cut my hair and trimmed my beard. I practiced speaking in the measured tones of commerce rather than the rough cadence of the wilderness. I took rooms at a respectable boarding house under the name Joseph Kent. I claimed to be a mining engineer, surveying investment opportunities in the region. My knowledge of mines lent credibility to this story. I spent the first week simply observing the town and its inhabitants. I located Harper's Emporium on the main street, an impressive two-story structure with plate glass windows and an ornate facade. I watched Harper himself arrive each morning in a fine carriage, a tall man in his 50s with silver at his temples and a prominent scar that ran from his right eye to the corner of his mouth. He carried himself with the confidence of success and social acceptance. I needed to know more about Harper's current circumstances, his weaknesses, his vulnerabilities. I began to frequent the saloons and cafes where business was discussed. I listened more than I spoke. I learned that while Harper appeared prosperous, there were rumors of financial difficulties. His latest expansion had been costly. He had borrowed heavily from the Territorial Bank. The railroad's changed route had reduced the flow of customers through Prescott. Competition from new merchants in Phoenix threatened his dominance. He had invested in a mining venture that showed disappointing returns. Most significantly, I discovered that Harper's reputation was his most prized possession. He had worked for 15 years to transform himself from a rough frontiersman to a pillar of society. He served as deacon in the local church. His wife was president of the Ladies' Aid Society. His daughter attended an exclusive boarding school in San Francisco. He cultivated the image of a self-made man who had risen through honest industry and Christian virtue. The carefully constructed facade concealed the blood and bones on which his success was built. I also sought information about Harper's former associates. The diary had mentioned several names. Fletcher the guide, who had led Sarah into the trap, a man called Tanner who had helped dispose of the bodies, a doctor named Whitfield who had examined the women before they were sold. Through careful questioning, I learned that Fletcher had indeed vanished years ago. Rumor suggested he had run afoul of Harper after demanding more money for his silence. Tanner now worked as Harper's warehouse manager. Dr. Whitfield maintained a practice on the edge of town. He treated patients other doctors refused, women in difficult circumstances, men with gunshot wounds who preferred discretion to official reports. I needed access to Harper's private records and correspondence, evidence that would connect him to his past crimes. I considered seeking employment in his store, but rejected the idea as too obvious. Instead, I cultivated a relationship with his clerk, Simmons, a thin, nervous man who had worked for Harper for 8 years. I encountered him initially at the bank, where he made daily deposits. I arranged subsequent meetings at a cafe he frequented. I spoke of investment opportunities, of partnerships that might prove mutually beneficial. Simmons was underpaid and underappreciated. He responded eagerly to my attention and apparent respect for his knowledge. Over several weeks I gained Simmons' trust. He began to speak more freely of his employer, of Harper's temper when crossed. of mysterious meetings after hours in the store's back office, of ledgers kept separate from the official accounts, of visitors who came by night and never through the front entrance. Simmons did not know the full extent of Harper's activities, but he suspected they extended beyond legitimate commerce. His suspicions aligned perfectly with Sarah's account. I developed my plan carefully. I would not kill Harper or his associates. Death was too simple, too clean. Instead, I would expose them. I would use Sarah's diary and whatever evidence I could, gather to reveal their past crimes. I would destroy the respectability they valued above all else. I would ensure they faced not only legal consequences, but the complete collapse of the lives they had built on their victims' suffering. I would be systematic, patient. I would dismantle their world piece by piece until nothing remained but ruin. The final element of my plan came when I learned of the upcoming Founders' Day celebration. Harper would host a gala at his home to commemorate the 15th anniversary of his arrival in Prescott. The territorial governor would attend, the judge, all the prominent citizens. Harper would be honored for his contributions to the community, the perfect moment for his unmasking. I secured an invitation through Simmons, who was flattered by my interest in local affairs. All the pieces were in place. Sarah would have her justice at last. I began by cultivating relationships with key figures in Prescott society. I attended church services where Harper served as deacon. I made modest but visible donations to his charitable causes. I expressed interest in his mining investments. Within a month of my arrival, Harper himself took notice of me. He invited me to his office to discuss potential business opportunities. I sat across from the man who had orchestrated Sarah's murder and smiled pleasantly as he spoke of development and progress. The scar on his face stood out vividly against his pale skin. I thought of Sarah's description, the man they call boss, Scarface. I maintained my composure with effort. Harper was cautious but eager for new capital. His financial situation was indeed precarious. He suggested I might wish to tour his warehouse to better understand his operation. This was precisely the opportunity I needed. The tour was conducted by Tanner, the warehouse manager, a burly man with cold eyes who had helped dispose of the evidence 15 years before. He did not recognize me. Why would he? I was no longer the young miner expecting his bride. I was a gray-haired businessman with spectacles and a measured manner. During the tour, I noticed a locked office at the rear of the warehouse. Tanner explained it contained records going back to the establishment of the business. When he was called away to address a delivery issue, I made note of the lock type and door construction. That night, I returned. The warehouse was poorly guarded. The lock yielded easily to the skills I had acquired during my years in the wilderness. Inside, I found what I sought. Ledgers dating to 1877, correspondence between Harper and his associates, records of transactions that could not bear scrutiny. Most damning was a small leather pouch containing personal effects taken from victims, a locket, a wedding band, a pearl-handled pocket knife with the initials S.R. Samuel Reeves, the man who had traveled with Sarah. Harper had kept trophies, physical evidence that connected him directly to the crimes described in Sarah's diary. I took only what I needed, careful not to alert him that his secrets had been discovered. I replaced the lock and left no trace of my entry. My next target was Dr. Whitfield. I approached him in his capacity as a physician. I claimed to suffer from recurring fevers contracted during my time in the wilderness. He prescribed the standard remedies. During subsequent visits, I guided our conversations toward his long residence in the territory, his association with Harper. I mentioned my interest in the history of Prescott, the development of commerce in the region, the obstacles early settlers had faced, including Indian attacks. Whitfield was an alcoholic. His hands trembled when not occupied with a glass. I encouraged his drinking during our conversations. As His tongue loosened. He began to speak more freely of the past, of arrangements made with certain guides to examine women before they were transported to houses in mining camps, of payments received for his discretion, of his current financial dependence on Harper, who provided patience and protection from official scrutiny. He did not confess directly to involvement in Sarah's case, but he revealed enough to confirm his role in the broader operation. I cultivated similar relationships with other figures mentioned in Sarah's diary: a former deputy, marshal who had helped cover up the false Apache attack, the owner of a freight company who had transported unwilling women to remote locations. Each conversation yielded additional evidence, additional confirmation of the network Harper had established, the crimes he had committed, the lives he had destroyed in building his empire of respectability. Throughout this process, I maintained my disguise as Joseph Kent, mining engineer and potential investor. I attended social functions where Harper and his wife were present. I exchanged pleasantries with the territorial judge who had no idea I was gathering evidence against his son-in-law. I donated to the orphanage Harper supported. I became a familiar and welcome presence in the society he had worked so hard to enter. All the while I was constructing the case that would destroy him. 2 days before the Founders' Day celebration, I made my final preparations. I had copies made of the most incriminating documents. I wrote letters to newspapers in Phoenix and Tucson detailing Harper's crimes with supporting evidence. I included excerpts from Sarah's diary with descriptions that could be verified. I arranged for these materials to be delivered during the celebration. I secured a room at the Grand Hotel across from Harper's Emporium. From there I would watch the collapse of his world after the revelations became public. The night of the celebration arrived. Harper's home was illuminated with lanterns. Carriages lined the street outside. The elite of territorial society gathered to honor him. I arrived early, dressed impeccably in a new suit. I carried a walking stick with a silver handle, a gift I intended to present to our host. I was greeted warmly, introduced to the governor and his wife, complimented on my contributions to the community during my short residence. I accepted a glass of champagne and waited. Harper made a grand entrance with his wife on his arm. She wore diamonds that glittered in the lamplight. He beamed with satisfaction as guests approached to congratulate him. The judge raised a toast to his success. The governor spoke of his exemplary citizenship. I watched from the edge of the gathering. I observed his pride, his certainty, his absolute confidence in the fortress of respectability he had built. I savored the knowledge of what was to come. When the moment arrived for the presentation of gifts, I stepped forward. I offered my walking stick with appropriate words of esteem. Harper accepted gratefully. As he examined the silver handle, I leaned close and whispered 5 words: "The Devil's Canyon Wagon Party." His face drained of color. His eyes met mine in shock and dawning recognition. Before he could respond, I stepped back into the crowd. I watched as he struggled to maintain his composure while looking at me with new understanding. Precisely on schedule, a messenger arrived. He carried telegrams for several guests, including the governor and the newspaper editor who was present. Urgent communications that could not wait until morning. I observed as they read the messages, as confusion and then consternation spread across their faces, as they looked toward Harper with new eyes. The editor approached him first, asked if he might have a private word. The governor followed. Harper glanced frantically around the room. His gaze found me by the doorway. I raised my glass in a silent toast. Then I departed. I returned to my hotel room with its clear view of Harper's home and business. Within an hour, carriages began to leave the celebration. Guests departed hurriedly, without the usual lingering farewells. Lights blazed in Harper's study, where an impromptu conference appeared to be taking place. I watched through the night as his carefully constructed world began to fracture. as the truth I had unearthed spread through the community he had sought to impress. By morning, the first newspaper accounts appeared, allegations of serious crimes committed by a prominent citizen, connections to disappearances long attributed to Indian attacks, evidence provided by a mysterious source. Harper's name was not printed, but everyone in Prescott knew who was meant. I observed from my window as unusual activity surrounded his home and business. The marshal and his deputies arrived, departed, returned with the judge. Concerned citizens gathered on street corners, speaking in hushed tones. Former friends crossed to the opposite side rather than pass directly by Harper's Emporium. Over the following days, the destruction I had orchestrated unfolded with the precision of a well-made timepiece. Harper's associates were questioned. Some fled, others attempted to save themselves by providing additional information. Whitfield took his own life rather than face exposure. Tanner was arrested trying to leave the territory. The bank called in Harper's loans. His merchandise was seized. His membership in the church revoked. His wife took their daughter and departed for her father's home, refusing to stand by him as evidence mounted. I did not participate directly in these events. I watched from a distance as justice, long delayed, finally found its target. I sent Sarah's diary anonymously to the territorial prosecutor, ensuring her voice would be heard in the proceedings against her murderers. I arranged for proper burial markers to be placed at Devil's Canyon for her and the others who had died there. Their true story recorded in stone rather than the false narrative of an Apache attack. Harper was arrested 1 week after the celebration. The charges were numerous and severe: kidnapping, murder, trafficking, fraud, the evidence overwhelming, the witness testimony damning. Former associates turned against him hoping for leniency. He was held without bail. His fine home was sold. To cover his debts, his business liquidated. His name became synonymous with depravity and criminal conspiracy. The fortress of respectability he had spent 15 years building collapsed in 15 days. I remained in Prescott long enough to see Harper brought before the court, to hear him plead not guilty despite the mountain of evidence, to witness the faces of the community as they confronted the monster they had honored. Then I departed. My work was complete. Sarah had her justice, not the swift violence of frontier retribution, but the complete dismantling of everything her murderer had built upon her suffering. Every brick of his success had been removed, every connection severed, every pretension to respectability stripped away. He was exposed fully as the predator Sarah had described in her final writings. I returned to Devil's Canyon in the spring of 1893, 16 years after Sarah disappeared. 1 year after I found her diary and brought down the man responsible for her death. The cave where I made my discovery was now marked on maps. Travelers stopped to view the place where evidence of Harper's crimes had been uncovered. I avoided these curiosity seekers. I made my own way to the site where Sarah and her fellow travelers had been attacked. The false scene of an Apache raid had been replaced with a proper memorial, the true story recorded for posterity. I stood before the stone bearing Sarah's name. Josiah Kane had fulfilled his promise. The long search was over. Justice had been served not through violence, but through truth. Harper remained in territorial prison, awaiting execution, his appeals exhausted, his former associates either jailed or fled or dead by their own hand. The network they had operated dismantled entirely. Other victims had been identified, other families given answers to long-standing questions. The territorial authorities had been forced to acknowledge their complicity in accepting the convenient fiction of Apache raids. I placed Sarah's diary in a metal box and buried it beneath her marker. Her words had done their work. They had exposed the truth, destroyed the guilty. Now they could rest with her. I remained at the site until sunset, speaking to her of all that had transpired, of the life we might have shared, of my journey through wilderness, both physical and spiritual, to find her again. As darkness fell, I said my final farewell. I would not return to this place. My promise was fulfilled, my task complete. I left Arizona soon after. The territory held too many memories, too much sorrow despite the justice achieved. I traveled north into the mountains. I found a small settlement in need of experienced miners. I built a cabin by a clear stream. I began again under my own name. Josiah Kane returned from the dead. I spoke little of my past. The people respected my privacy. I found a measure of peace in honest work and simple living. Sometimes, in the quiet evenings, I read the copies I had made of Sarah's early diary entries, the hopeful words she had written before tragedy intervened. I remembered her as she had been, full of life and dreams for our future together. I no longer saw her as a victim, but as the instrument of her own justice, her courage in recording the truth, her foresight in preserving evidence. Her words had reached across 15 years to guide my hand, to ensure that those who had harmed her paid the full measure of their debt. I am an old man now. The century is turning. The frontier exists only in memory and story. The Arizona Territory has become a state. Prescott is a modern city with electric lights and automobiles. The events I have recorded here are seldom discussed. History has moved forward, leaving the tragedies of the past behind. But I remember. I keep faith with Sarah and her final words. I ensured that her story was told, that justice was served, that truth prevailed over convenient lies. This is my legacy. This is my peace.